Hi everyone, and please welcome to this lunch seminar. Just a few words before Sonja will start. You may have noticed that this seminar is recorded. That means that if you have any questions to Sonja, you're very welcome to ask the questions, but you need this mic so your question is heard also in the recording. And for that reason, we also take the questions in the end. But there will be time for questions in the end. So I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Sonja Buchegger, that will talk today about data privacy, personal and political. Thank you, Sonja. Please.
Thank you for inviting me. And I was here last week and listened to the previous speaker, Kia Höck. And now I know where I'll spend most of my Wednesday lunches and probably see some of you here as well. So I'm a professor of computer science in the theoretical computer science division of the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science School at KTH. And I'm interested in privacy, obviously, in research and also teaching. So I also teach a course on privacy enhancing technologies. But today is more about what's going on in privacy in 2018. There is a lot that has happened and is going on this year. And then I want to look a bit into what kinds of research activities, fields, questions are there, and give you a glimpse of what's happening there, and also from our own research. And then at the end, talk a bit about, so given all this, what can we do as individuals, at home, at work, in the public space, as citizens. So 2018, lots of stuff happening. There was the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU that came into effect in May and is now the binding regulation for data protection in Europe and any data that comes from Europe. So it also concerns countries outside of Europe. And there would be a whole extra talk to go through all the regulations. I just briefly give you some highlights. Changes from the previous directive on data protection that you might have heard of from '95 are that now this is actually a regulation and not just a directive, which is sort of a recommendation and can be interpreted differently in different countries, but the regulation is actually trying to make it the same everywhere in Europe, and limits what the individual countries can do. And there is a one-stop shop in each country where one can go and complain if something is not according to the law. There are also quite hefty fees as a percentage of the turnover if there are breaches. And there are rights, for example, of data portability, so you can get your data and that is stored by some company and put it somewhere else. And there is some strict regulation on notification if there is some privacy breach. And there are a whole lot of fair information principles, such as data minimization. You should only collect the data that is actually needed for a specific purpose. This purpose needs to be specified, and there's also purpose binding, so one cannot just collect data for one purpose and get the consent from people and then use it for something else. And consent is another area that has gotten a bit stronger, or also maybe a bit more annoying. If you've seen all these we have cookies messages on websites, or oh, you're in the EU, well, we haven't really implemented GDPR, so you can't access our US news website for the moment. So lots of regulations, many rights for individuals, and also many duties for companies that collect or process the data, so data controllers, data processors, and it's still a bit unsure how things are going to be interpreted in court, so all this has not been tested much, so we'll see how that goes. Then this year was also lots of news and scandals about attempts to manipulate votes, to manipulate the news, have influence on politics via social media, via analysis of people's demographics and behavior and so on, trying to target news to specific populations, hard to tell what's real, what's just made up. And maybe one of the more prominent scandals was this Cambridge Analytica scandal, where it started out as a personality test, a quiz that you could do on Facebook, and that would give you your score for the big 5 personality traits that are listed here. And based on that and the app, the quiz also having access to not just the people that actually click on the quiz, but also their friends and so on. So collecting millions of records of people that didn't even, click on this, and correlating it with this psychometric result, trying to target news and recommendations at people according to what they thought their leanings were. And there is a lot of effort that went in, and the scandal was very big. It's not clear whether it actually worked. So there's also research showing that when it comes to a political ideology, then it's really hard to shift people from one position to another. So maybe people that are uncertain, you could nudge a bit into some direction, but people that really are left-wing or right-wing or have some other conviction are not swayed by facts. So even if the facts are counter their ideology, they find some, or we find some story to still treat it as evidence that we're right in our conviction. So the effect might be limited. Then similarly, not for manipulation of politics, but for nudging people toward buying stuff, similar technology is used to target advertisement based on behavioral analysis and on tracking. And if you have bought this, then maybe you're interested in that. And there are no good studies showing how well does this actually work. So anecdotally, it's often creepy that you get some advertisement of something you've shown an interest in, or you get the advertisement again and again and again for something that you just bought. So you're less likely to buy that again. But it's a huge market, so it must be working for someone, maybe for those selling ad space. We'll have to see. Another big topic is this whole big data, data analysis, artificial intelligence, and what happens if it's not people that decide about us in different situations, but it's computers that do machine learning and that collect a lot of data and draw inferences from that data and then put us in some categories. And sometimes it's bad to be categorized wrongly, like if you just happen to be at the same restaurant as a terrorist suspect, maybe you will also get put into the suspect category, or maybe you will correctly be categorized as a bad driver, and your insurance rate will go up. And there was some statistics saying that like 80% of people think that they are better than average drivers. So if then the data shows something different, that might be disappointing or expensive even. And so how is this done? Well, tracking where we click, how we behave online, when we are where, who we talk to, and their behavior, and our location data, and taking all different sorts of data together that individually are not really threatening to our privacy. But if you take them together, then you can draw inferences that were not in the data, and you can learn something rightly or wrongly. And machine learning algorithms or artificial intelligence work on these data and do the analysis according to different algorithms. Not all of them are explainable to humans. So for some of these algorithms, they come up with some result, and we don't quite know how that decision happened. Another thing that happened this year was the 5th anniversary of the Snowden revelations. So we learned about some surprising, maybe to some not so surprising, capabilities of government surveillance, of what kind of data is being collected, how much of it can be collected, what is inferred, what is stored, what is exchanged between countries, and so on. And there haven't been any big news about how this has been drastically reduced. I think we would have heard about that. So that's sort of the situation that we're looking at in 2018, and then my first picture was a cloud, so there's also lots of cloud computing, Internet of Things, and so on. So lots of ways where our data and data about our data and about us and our behavior are collected, inferences are drawn for different uses, and leaks can happen inadvertently, accidentally, by hacking, or deliberately by sharing information with others. So what does the research say about this? Well, so here are some acronyms of different approaches to privacy research. The first is fairness, accountability, and transparency, and I'm going to talk about each of them in turn. The second is privacy-enhancing technologies, where I'm active, and the third is surveillance studies, and there's a surveillance studies network. And when trying to put these pieces together, it's quite clear that the engineering perspective alone or computer science perspective alone is not enough. So if I take a caricature of an engineering approach, then it's like, well, we have something that we think is a problem, and then we design a solution, and we define the requirements, and then we evaluate the solution based on the requirements that we made, and lots of assumptions, and we focus on things like performance and does it behave as expected, and so on. And in computer science, then we go a little bit further, and we formalize things and have actual proofs that given these assumptions, then these properties hold. But still, we cannot take all the assumptions and requirements into account that we don't see from the engineering perspective. We cannot foresee what the effect would be in an ecosystem of technology in 30 years. And what we think users need or people need might not be always the same as the actual people if you ask them. And so surveillance studies is an interdisciplinary approach to protect privacy, and computer science and engineering in general is just a small part of it, and there's also humanities, social sciences, legal perspectives, and so on. Philosophy, history, all these bigger topics that we need to have actually working solutions. FAT, I was saying before, since fairness, accountability, and transparency. And this is a very recent development to put this all together that came with the concern of exactly automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence. How can we make sure that these actually work correctly and in a way that is understandable and fair? And fairness in this sense is a concern about bias. So there could be discrimination by the algorithm that analyzes the data, or the data itself could already be biased and have like a bias, a different skew according to race or gender or class or any other of these dimensions. So we want to know that if there is a machine making decisions about us, that it's fair, and we need to know how that works. So there are conferences now called ACM FAT and ACM FAT ML. So ACM is a computer science organization, and ML is for machine learning, so different focus on these FAT concerns. Then there is also a concern about accountability. So how do we know that these algorithms or these systems are actually doing what they're saying they do, and are complying with the law, are complying with the GDPR, like, have privacy by design principles, and so on. And the third concern of transparency is, like, how can we explain what actually happens? Can I go there and say, okay, I have been categorized as a bad driver. What is this based on? I think I'm a good driver. And then they should be able to explain to me, well, you know, you tend to speed up like this, or whatever the parameters are that they're using. But I would like to know what happens. How do I end up in some category? And then there is, of course, the whole concern of privacy. So what do we share with others, and what control do we have over our data? And these fairness, accountability, and transparency issues are good to have from organizations or companies that have a power position, but they're not so good to request from an individual. So an individual might have concerns more about privacy and, like, not having to be transparent about everything, account for everything, and you know, be fair in everything. So we're people, and we need to have some sort of way of navigating what to share with whom and on our terms. And so it's a question of power. So who has the power toward whom? So the probably makes sense that a public institution has, like in Sweden, offentlighetsprincipen and a lot of transparency about how decisions are made and what they are based on, but maybe not for an individual. And you have different contexts in the home, at work, in public, who relates to whom. So it's not always so easy to say, you know, this needs to be done. But if we go back to the individual, then we have some properties that enhance privacy and that give us some influence about our data and inferences drawn about us. So one of these properties is deniability. So am I able to say that, well, you can't prove that I was doing this or that, or that I was at this location? You know, there are several that look like me, and it might have been them. And so what is a sort of plausible deniability from a technical perspective? Another concern is anonymity. So I don't want to be traced back, for example, if I'm going to websites that are about a specific health condition, or if I do like search queries that are revealing that I don't want to share with others, then I would like to have anonymity and not being tracked back. And I would also like to have control over how much do I share with whom and when, and in what circumstances, and for how long can I do this? And another concern that we have is that, well, sometimes we want to have verifiability. We want to check that, for example, our vote was counted, but we don't want to show everyone which party we voted for. And there are several such constellations where we want to have the option of checking that something was done, but not sharing more than we want to have. So let's see some sample cases of privacy-enhancing technologies. So I just put up 3 categories here briefly. Tor, people might have heard of Tor. Who has heard of Tor? Yeah, so against trying to combat traffic analysis and enable you to browse to those health websites, for example, without being tracked back, or also to combat censorship, so that you can come from a different side. If like in your country you're not allowed to search for a specific term or some content, then you can use Tor to send your packet around and it comes from somewhere random. Identity is another topic for privacy-enhancing technologies, and I have 2 examples here, one from Microsoft, UProof, and one from IBM, Identity Mixer, IDMix. And these are so-called anonymous credentials. And sometimes we give much more information and data about ourselves than is actually needed for a specific situation. So if I rent a movie from some streaming service, for example, then it should be enough to say that, yes, I have an account, I have paid, I'm over 18, so I can watch this movie. And what we are doing now is saying, okay, here is my credit number, here is my exact date of birth, here is my name, here's my address, here is the history of all the movies I have watched with you, here are my preferences, here is what I liked more, here is when I watched things, and so on. So thinking about like switching perspective a bit, like what do we actually need to do some particular transaction? unless advertising is your business model, then that changes things a bit. But with these anonymous credentials, cryptographically, you can do what is called zero knowledge proofs of knowledge. So you can say, I can prove to you that I have a driver's license, for example, but I don't have to show by whom and when I got it. And I can prove that I'm over 18, but I don't have to show you my birth certificate and or birth date and so on. And another privacy-enhancing technology here at KTH by Douglas Wikström, also from the TCS division, is about electronic voting. So how can you do voting online such that your vote is counted, but only once? You can verify it, but it's not leaked to anyone what you voted for, not even to yourself as a receipt that you could show to someone who's coercing you and trying to force you to vote a specific way. And what we have been doing in our group, I'm going to give some brief examples, but first I would like to just tell you what we're aiming for. And briefly, we use systems design and cryptography to develop privacy-enhancing technologies, so these PETs, to protect people from surveillance. And surveillance can be government surveillance, or it could be, companies that try to target advertisements or news at you, or it could be, just what is also called surveillance, so surveillance by your neighbors or friends, so that you have some control over what you share with whom. And one approach that we're using quite often is decentralization. So in a system where you have a centralized owner that can collect all the data and analyze it and put together many sources, then the risk for privacy breaches is quite high. You can draw inferences, you can, if data is lost, a lot is leaked at once. So what we've been trying to do is to break up this centralized control and have decentralized systems. And there, individuals can control their privacy much more, but we also have to deal with problems that the centralized system had solved. So we're looking into things like, how do you even log in a completely decentralized system? There is no company with a help desk where you can call and have your password reset, for example. So we came up with a decentralized system of still using passwords, even if you have multiple devices, and that you can revoke and log out of a device if that's stolen, for example, and change and get reminders and so on. Another problem, and this was in the context of distributed online social networks, so the idea of, okay, if Facebook is so bad with privacy and everyone's moaning about it, how about we look how far we can go without a centralized provider? And then if you have a social network that's for people that care about privacy, then how do you find them? They might still want to be found by their friends, but if everything's locked down, how do you do that? And we came up with a system that roughly says, if you know enough about me, or if you know these specific things that I can specify, then you can unlock a pointer that tells you where I am. So this gets rid of random spammers, people that don't know you well, and then narrows it down to who can reach you, and then you can still say, no, I don't want to connect. Then there's also things that central providers protect, like I want to control who can access what, but I also want to control what they see of who else can access my photo album. I don't want to have people come up to me saying, oh, I saw I have access to 2 pictures, but there were 18 more, and Anna and Bertil have access to that. So how can we do access control without giving away the policy of this access control? And we also did events organizations. Then we moved on from more like, okay, social networks, interesting for us just as private people, but what if it's more serious? What if we are political protesters in an oppressive regime? So how can we do messaging that we can then deny that we sent something or what we sent? And given what we know from Snowden, we need to do this assuming that some agency has the transcript of everything that has been sent over the net. So how can we still do that? And another example is a little bit similar to e-voting and was motivated by this fake news example of how many people were there at Trump's inauguration. And so we wanted to come up with a system where you can count verifiably, so everyone can like redo the count. And now the approaches are more like estimation, or they depend on some infrastructure. But if you're protesting, for example, against the government, we have to count with them switching off any infrastructure or you know, the mobile phone network. And so we want to have verifiable counting, but also preserve the privacy and not endanger people more than they already are by being there physically, and someone could take their picture. And so we developed a protocol based on distance bounding, smartphones, lots of crypto, and yeah, hopefully we still have some assumptions on hardware that doesn't exist yet, but hopefully soon. And that was just as one example that you know, there is a combination of fairness, accountability, transparency, and privacy that you can put together. If you have like private but verifiable counting, then you have this combination that you can say, we counted this many people, the police counted that many people, but here is how we did it. And we didn't give any information away about the individual. So what can we do about this whole situation of online privacy and privacy-enhancing technology being there, but not deployed so much? Well, one thing we can do is to know our rights and exercise them. So we can get informed about what does this GDPR thing entail really, and what can we do? And also in the workplace, think from the other side. You know, what data am I handling? How am I handling it? Do I really need all this data for that specific purpose? Am I trying to do some analysis of data just because it's here, but it wasn't originally specified? So take responsibility for dealing with other people's data. Then you can do things like trying to stop tracking. You can put plugins in your browser. You can use a Tor browser. You can use Ghostery to block tracking, or uBlock for advertisements, and so on. And thinking about uploads in a wider context. So what we upload, like our data online, is actually just the tip of the iceberg. But underneath there is a huge part also, and that is behavior, that is what others upload about us, that is what can be inferred from traffic analysis, from browser fingerprinting, from tracking us across sites, from cookies, and so on. And also, we need to think that much of this is invisible, so it's really hard to keep track of what is actually going on. And it's not so easy to know what will this look like in the future. So I have some audience in mind now that should see this picture, or I want to get, this genomics analysis to see compatibility with some medication. But I have to also think that, in that case, I'm not just saying something about myself, but also about my children. Or if I put up pictures and we have face recognition and there are claims for machine learning algorithm that can detect with a 90% probability whether one is gay or straight from a picture by face recognition and features, then the consequences are sometimes more dire and not immediate. Also, we've seen that the audience increases over time. So copying data is cheap, storage is cheap, stuff gets archived, stuff gets copied, and once the cat is out of the bag or the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's hard to get it back in. So we can't really change our mind about something completely and take it off again. Well, so these were some things to do, and I would like to acknowledge also the people that worked with me, so my postdocs and PhD students. Sakib is here right now. And also acknowledge the pictures. I thought during lunchtime, you should have nice pictures to look at and not formulas, but they mostly come from unsplash.com. So I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Sonja. Do you have any questions? So just raise your hand. Yes?
So you talked about the machine learning privacy. So I was going through lastly this deep learning and neural network stuff, and it said that it's hard for even the developer or machine learning expert to say why the neural network or the deep learning network is behaving like that. So what can we do in that sense? Like, then we don't know like why this is categorizing me in that part, because it's very difficult or it's near impossible to say why the network is behaving like that.
Yeah, so for individual cases, then it's very difficult. But the people using deep learning or neural networks, they also don't just toss something at it and hope it goes well. But there are lots of research activities on looking at what is the outcome. Can there be bias? Is there some population that's overrepresented? What does the data look like that is collected? And you can have different sorts of test cases. But it's true that individually, that is something you cannot explain in an algorithmic way. So I think that's another example where we really need to have input from, philosophy, history, law, sociology, anthropology to deal with, how do we handle decisions and uncertainty and incomplete information. And I'm sure there are lots of examples from the past that one could use to see, okay, in this society it was handled like that, and it's problematic, and we need to adjust to that reality.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. My question is about GDPR. What do you think there are the disadvantages, and if you feel it hinders research?
I think that the current disadvantage is a bit of uncertainty, that people are not quite sure, are we compliant, is this personal data, is this sensitive data, what is the standard of security I need to keep, what's the standard of privacy impact assessment, how strict is it with the purpose, what is meaningful consent, you know, reading this, can I expect people to read this whole terms of service and privacy agreements and write whatever in there. So I think that's the biggest hurdle right now, that it has not been tested. We haven't seen many results of saying, okay, here was a court decision saying that you know, that was not okay, and you get fined 2% of your turnover or 4%. So I think that many are probably cautious now and try not to you know, overstep. On the other hand, when it comes to research specifically, then the rules are much freer than if it is only for a company and for advertising purposes, for example. So if there's like a public interest, then that has a different basis.
More questions? So I think we have time for one more question from the audience. If you don't have any, I have one. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of the ethics of the privacy-enhancing technologies, because used in the right hands, like people who need to like escape from an oppressive regime, they are very, very valuable. But then it's a double-edged sword, right? They can also be used by a terrorist network, and then it comes in a different light. Do you have anything to say about sharing this knowledge?
So this is a general technology problem, right? You can use a hammer to build a house for the poor, or you can use a hammer to bash someone's head in. So privacy-enhancing technology is no exception, but it's maybe a bit more complicated because we sometimes have this like simplistic argument of so there is security and public safety at one side and privacy on the other, and if we just give up privacy, then we can protect all crime, and there will be no, you know, terrorism attack. That's not really how it works, and privacy is also in different perspectives, but some see it as like a human right, and there is just some border that, I mean, you have integritet in Swedish, so there's also some integrity of our own being that should not be breached, and behavior in a panopticon or in a complete surveillance has a chilling effect. So the surveillance has a chilling effect on the behavior, and we change our behavior when we think we're being watched. And so there are lots of these trade-offs, complicated ethical decisions to make. And then there is also no guarantee that if we don't develop it, like if there are no, I don't know, anonymous credentials for people who just want to, you know, not be giving more information than they need, that maybe, you know, terrorists or criminals would come up with the technology anyhow. But, you know, this is all multi-faceted, and I see that online this is a bit more complicated than just with the hammer. You know, we have things to think about like terrorism or, you know, child pornography, or like unambiguously ethically wrong things within the constraints of some society. And but if we have human rights, then we have human rights for everyone. So it's hard to really say one way or another. But I think I'm more in the camp of we have rights, and technology can be used for good and bad, and let's make it easier to be used for good.
Okay, thanks again.
All right, thank you.
And we always have a little gift, and since you were here last time, you know perhaps what it is.
Yes, I saw that.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening.
Yeah,
okay.
thank you.